There are some parables of Jesus that are difficult to really understand what he's getting at. One such is the shrewd manager. Well, let's give it a shot. You're watching At the Pastor's Desk. The parable of the shrewd manager is one of those parables that honestly a lot of pastors like to kind of go around. This text actually does appear in our lectionary series, and oftentimes, and I don't blame them, pastors will maybe spend that week not preaching on the gospel, but will instead preach on the Old Testament or the epistle lesson, because this parable can be really confusing if not viewed through the proper lens. This parable is found exclusively in Luke, so if you want to follow along, it's Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9. Let's go ahead and read through this text so we've got the story in front of us, and then we'll try and dissect it and figure out what exactly is Jesus trying to teach here. He also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'For what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings.'" So we've got two main characters in this story. We have a rich man, a master, and we have a manager. Now this manager is described as shrewd or dishonest. Literally in the Greek, he is called unrighteous. And so we have this unrighteous manager. And right away from the top, we see why this man, this manager, is called unrighteous or dishonest. This manager was charged with wasting his master's possessions. And as a manager of the master's possessions, this is not a good thing to do as the manager. And the master catches him and says, "All right, what is this you've done? You've been wasting my possessions. Go get the record books, bring them back to me. You can't be manager anymore." And so he knows he's going to be fired once he goes and gets these books. And so as a last-ditch effort, this is where the shrewdness kind of comes in, he then goes behind the master's back to these debtors and says, "Hey, I'm going to cut your debt down." And so he cuts their debt down. The master finds out about this, and then instead of punishing him, he commends him for his shrewdness, for going behind his back and doing this. And so this really is a strange parable, and sometimes it's kind of hard to understand exactly what Jesus is saying here. Is he saying that we should go behind people's backs, that we should be shrewd like this manager was, so that we gain favor for ourselves, so that we're good, our back's covered? Doesn't seem like something Jesus would say. And this manager, are we supposed to be okay with other people going behind our backs in order to cover their back? Because, wow, that was pretty smart. That was pretty shrewd. Should we be commending that kind of action, that kind of living? So you can see why this parable is a difficult one. But there is a proper way to look at this parable, at least as far as we can tell. And that is to figure out who to really focus on in this parable. Are we to focus on the dishonest manager in this parable? Or, like the parable of the prodigal son, should we focus more on the master? If you haven't seen the video on the prodigal son, go ahead and click up here to see that. But if you have seen it, then you probably can guess who I'm going to say is the central character here. The central character in this parable, the parable of the shrewd manager, is actually the master himself. And this parable, focusing in on the master, makes more sense than focusing in on the shrewd manager. Because when you look at the master, it doesn't come right out and say this, but if you look closely at the details, you can see that this master is very generous. And that is actually the center of this parable, that you should be looking for the generosity of the master. And in fact, you as a shrewd manager should not be unrighteous, but be righteous. Act as the manager would act. Let me kind of explain this a bit. So it starts off, and we talked about the title of this manager, that he is unrighteous. And this kind of sets him up as opposite of this master. The manager is being unrighteous, wasteful with his master's possessions, which leads us to believe that the master then is righteous. He is the opposite of this. Now, we don't see this right off the bat, but as we go on, we'll see that he is indeed righteous. We see here that the master doesn't fire this manager right off the bat. The master would have been completely within his right to see that this manager is wasting his possessions and say, no, drop everything. You are fired right here. I'll send someone else to go get the books. You get out. But he doesn't do this. He says, go get your books, go get the account for your management and bring it here. And so he gives him the opportunity to go get the books and bring them back, which is really a dangerous thing for this master to do, to let this shrewd manager do, because this manager was already wasting his possessions. And so now, knowing that he's going to get fired, this manager would then have the added opportunity to mess with the books, to hurt the master further. And so it really wouldn't make sense that the master would let him go do this. He'd send someone else that he trusts, but he doesn't. He lets this manager, this shrewd, unrighteous manager, go and get the books to bring them back. So then at this point, the manager doesn't really know what to do. So he says, I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm too ashamed to beg. I've got an idea. I'm going to lower the debts. So even if the master's mad at me, I will be in good standing with these people and they'll take me in and take care of me. And this next part is where we see the generosity of the master, even though he's technically not in this next line. The manager goes to these people and asks them their debts and then lowers them. And this is where we see the generosity of the master, because this proves that the master was in the habit of lowering debts. If the master never lowered anyone's debt lower than what they owed or should have owed, then they would have seen this kind of activity and been suspicious, would have said, the master never lowers our debts. I think you're up to something, and I would rather not listen to you and listen to the master than listen to you and then get in trouble with the master. But they go along with it. They don't have any kinds of doubts or anything like that. They don't question the manager at all. They simply receive this lowering of the debts. And so this shows that this is kind of what the master would do anyway. He would lower those debts. And so they think nothing of it. They think that this is the master. This is what the master is doing for them, not the manager trying to sneak a quick one in on the master. And then the master finds out about this. And instead of punishing him by saying, hey, you shouldn't have canceled those debts, I'm going to punish you even further, he commends him for his shrewdness. He commends him for lowering those debts. And I believe that the reason that he does this is because the manager, the dishonest manager, the shrewd manager, has begun to act in the way that the master would. He acts with mercy, with righteousness. And this may shed some light upon that first statement where he was wasting the master's possessions. He may not have been wasting in the way that we typically think of it, but this wasting may have been the unrighteousness of charging too much, of holding these people to the fullness of their debts, opposed to the master who would be in the practice of lowering people's debts, taking away those debts, not charging them the full cost of what they would actually owe. And so when he begins to lower others' debts, the master sees this and commends him because he is now acting in a righteous manner. Now, what makes this kind of complicated is the statement that Jesus gives at the end. Most of the time, Jesus ends his parables with a clear statement of what that parable is supposed to mean. Well, here, it kind of doesn't. Let me read it to you again, starting in the middle of verse 8. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their dealings with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. So Jesus says that the sons of this world are shrewd in their dealings with each other more than the sons of light are in their dealings. Jesus commends this type of shrewdness. He says to make friends with this unrighteous wealth or unrighteous mammon, so that when that fails, and it will fail, then you will be welcomed into the eternal dwellings. And so here Jesus seems to be saying, these things, the riches of this world, the mammon, the materials that we have, these things will fail, but use those things to gain friends, gain good standing with your neighbors, so that when those things do fail, when the end of time comes, when death comes upon us, then they may welcome you into eternity. That through this unrighteous wealth, unrighteous mammon, the things of this world, you may have the opportunity to share the gospel with them, and they may be saved. And so then when you die, they will welcome you into eternal life because they will be there as well. So this parable seems to say, what Jesus seems to be saying, is that we should be generous in how we handle this mammon, this earthly wealth, and use it for the good of the kingdom, that we would use it to help others, that we would then be able to share the gospel with them, and that we should always look to the kindness of the Master, that we should always look to the kindness of God, that he is constantly forgiving our debts of sin, that he is looking upon us with compassion and mercy, and that we should use the gifts that we've been given to help serve our neighbor. Now, there is a lot of debate about this parable, what it means, what it doesn't mean. Should you allegorize it? Should you not? When you do allegorize it, does it fall apart? Does it hold any water? There's a lot to go into this parable, a lot more than we can spend in this video, at least a lot more than you would want to watch. And so if you've got questions about it or have a different view on how this parable should be interpreted, go ahead and leave those in the comments. I'd love to interact with you on those. And if you want, we can spend more time on this parable. It is a bit confusing. And even the greatest, smartest pastors don't fully comprehend this parable. It's one of those that we'll have to ask Jesus exactly what he had in mind when we get to heaven and see him. So thank you for sticking with me through this parable. Like this video, share it with others who you think might benefit from it. Check out any other videos that you may have missed, and we'll keep them coming at you. So stay tuned, take care, God bless.